I've been a mechanic for 35 years. Cars, they make sense to me. When something's wrong, there's always a reason, always a trail to follow. People are different. Sometimes the signs are there, but we choose not to see them. That's what happened with Linda and me. We had what I thought was a good life in our suburban home. Nothing fancy, just comfortable routine, morning coffee together, weekend barbecues, the usual stuff of a 30-year marriage. Linda worked at the medical billing office, I had my auto repair shop, and our life had a rhythm to it. A predictable melody, you could say. I remember exactly when that melody changed. It was a Tuesday evening, and we were driving to Miller's Market for our weekly grocery run. Linda was humming something, not our usual oldies or the country songs we both loved. This was different, more modern. When I asked her about it, she hesitated for just a fraction of a second before answering, "Oh, just something from the radio." Simple words, but something in her voice hit a wrong note. That song stayed with me, nagging at the back of my mind like a check engine light you can't quite explain. I started noticing things I'd missed before. How Linda's overtime hours had a pattern to them. How she kept her phone closer than she used to, always face down. Small things, really, the kind of things you'd ignore if you weren't already feeling that something was off. But it was the song that kept coming back. I'd catch her listening to it when she thought I wasn't around, in her earbuds while cooking, in her car before she noticed me in the driveway. Each time she'd quickly switch it off, like hiding evidence. That's the thing about suspicion. Once it takes root, it grows in the quiet moments, in the small changes, in the new habits that don't fit the old patterns. Looking back now, I realize that's how trust dies, not with a bang, but with a melody that doesn't belong to you. A song that becomes a key, unlocking questions you never wanted to ask about the person sleeping beside you for 3 decades. It started with Linda's phone. She never used to be protective of it. We'd shared passwords, computers, everything. But that morning, she left it on the kitchen counter while taking a shower, and when I went to pass it to her, the screen lit up. That's when I saw it. Spotify, showing the same song on repeat, the one she'd been humming in the car. Being a mechanic teaches you to look for patterns. When something keeps showing up, it usually means something. So I started paying attention, really paying attention. Linda had her late nights at the office every Tuesday and Friday, like clockwork. She'd come home with this energy about her, almost glowing, but distant somehow. When I'd ask about her day, she'd give these vague answers, then quickly change the subject. I knew I could check her phone, dig through her emails, but that felt wrong. Instead, I focused on what I knew best: cars. Modern vehicles are like rolling computers, storing everything from GPS locations to Bluetooth connections. Linda didn't know this, but every time she played that song, every place she stopped, it was all there in the car's memory. One night after she'd gone to bed, I went to the garage. Our car's infotainment system told a story she didn't want me to know. The song played every Tuesday and Friday at 6:30 p.m. The GPS showed the same address each time, 1542 Maple Drive, a small house on the outskirts of town. My hands were shaking as I wrote down the address. 30 years of marriage, and here I was, finding out the truth through cached data and playlist history. The irony wasn't lost on me. All this time looking for signs in her behavior, and the evidence was sitting in our driveway, recorded in cold digital certainty. The next Tuesday, I told Linda I had a late repair job. Instead, I parked my truck across from 1542 Maple Drive at 6:15 p.m. The house looked ordinary enough, white trim, small garden, nothing special. But my stomach was in knots. Part of me wanted to drive away, pretend I'd never found the address. Go back to before the song, before the suspicion. At 6:28, Linda's car pulled up. She checked her appearance in the rearview mirror, something she'd stopped doing for me years ago. The song started playing through her car speakers. I could see the blue glow of the Bluetooth display. 2 minutes early, just like she used to be for our dates, back when we were young. A man came out to greet her, mid-50s, well-dressed, with the kind of confidence that comes easy to some people. He hugged her, and Linda melted into him like she belonged there. They didn't rush inside like guilty people. They took their time, comfortable, familiar. This wasn't some fling. This was a routine, their routine. Through the windshield of my truck, I watched my wife of 30 years kiss another man. The same lips that had wished me goodbye that morning were now smiling at him, laughing at something he'd said. The song was probably still playing inside her car, their little soundtrack. I sat there for another hour after they went inside, just staring at the house. You'd think I'd feel rage, but all I felt was this hollow ache, like someone had reached inside my chest and scraped out everything that mattered. Every memory of our life together was being rewritten in my head, every late night, every business trip, every distracted kiss. The mechanic in me wanted to analyze it, break it down into manageable parts. But some things can't be fixed with tools and logic. Some breaks run too deep. I went back to my shop after watching them, but I couldn't focus on work. My hands kept slipping on the tools I'd used for decades without thinking. Every car radio I saw reminded me of that damn song. Every Bluetooth connection light mocked me with its steady blue pulse. I looked up the guy online that night. James Morrison, real estate developer. His office was in one of those glass towers downtown that I'd always thought looked cold and impersonal. Now I knew he was cold and personal. His company website showed him smiling with his arm around clients, wearing that same confident expression I'd seen earlier. He specialized in transforming properties. Funny how he was transforming my marriage, too. Linda came home at her usual time, 9:30 p.m. She had some story ready about a difficult client, computer problems, the usual excuses. I watched her move around our kitchen, humming that song again, like she couldn't help herself. She didn't know that I could see right through her now, that every note was a confession. "How about some music while we eat?" I suggested, reaching for my phone. Her fork paused halfway to her mouth. "I heard this great song the other day." "Oh," she tried to sound casual, but I saw her shoulders tense. "Yeah, let me find it." I pretended to scroll through my playlist, watching her from the corner of my eye. It's been stuck in my head. Her hands were trembling slightly. "I'm actually pretty tired, Tom. Maybe we could just eat quietly." I nodded, letting her think she'd dodged it. But we both sat there in silence, the unplayed song hanging between us like an accusation. I realized then that knowledge wasn't enough. I needed more than just the truth. I needed her to know that I knew. Needed to see her face when her carefully built world of lies came crashing down. The mechanic in me had diagnosed the problem. Now it was time to start the repairs. My way. As a mechanic, I know that timing is everything. You can have all the right parts, all the right tools, but if your timing's off, everything falls apart. That's why I spent the next week planning, watching, learning their patterns. The song became my constant companion. I downloaded it, played it on repeat, until every note felt like a knife twist. I needed to understand what made it special to them, needed to turn their weapon into mine. I learned that James Morrison had a reputation for fixing troubled properties, buying them cheap and selling high. His company website bragged about his transformative vision. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was a man who specialized in seeing potential in broken things, yet he was breaking my marriage for his own benefit. Linda's routine was precise. She'd leave work at 6:15 every Tuesday and Friday, telling her office she had yoga class. Instead, she'd drive to his house, always parking in the same spot, always checking her lipstick in the mirror before going inside. The song would play as she walked to his door. I could see the Bluetooth connection active on her car's dashboard every time. Their little ritual, their private soundtrack. I started making small changes at home, subtle things that would make her doubt herself. I'd move her coffee cup to a different spot after she'd set it down, rearrange the shoes by the door. Little things that would make her wonder if she was losing track of details. When she'd mention it, I'd just shrug, act confused. "It was always there," I'd say, or "You must have forgotten." The same way she'd been gaslighting me with her excuses and lies. During the days, I kept working on cars, but my mind was always spinning, planning. Every vehicle that came into my shop became a learning opportunity. Modern cars store so much data, location history, phone connections, audio preferences. I started keeping notes on different models, their vulnerabilities, their hidden features. Knowledge is power, and in the digital age, cars know everything about their owners. I created a fake email account and signed up for his company's newsletter, started following their social media. Every post showed him at some charity event or property opening, always with that same confident smile. I wondered if Linda had seen him at any of these events, if she'd stood in the background while he charmed other people's wives. The hardest part was maintaining normalcy at home. Linda would talk about her day, carefully editing out the parts that mattered, and I'd listen like I didn't know every lie. Sometimes she'd slip up on small details, mention being somewhere she wasn't supposed to be, or forget which story she'd told me earlier. I'd watch her catch herself, see the momentary panic in her eyes before she smoothed it over with another lie. Each mistake was like a loose thread in her carefully woven deception, and I was noting every single one. At night, I'd lie awake beside her, listening to her steady breathing, wondering how many times she'd gone to sleep next to me while thinking of him. The song would play in my head during these quiet hours, its melody becoming a blueprint for what I needed to do. Because that's what good mechanics do. We find the problem, we gather our tools, and we fix things. Sometimes fixing means taking everything apart first. Being a mechanic for so long teaches you that every machine has a breaking point. The trick is knowing exactly where to apply the pressure. I spent another week studying their patterns, but this time I started testing the weak spots in their routine. One Tuesday, I deliberately kept Linda's car in the shop longer than necessary for its service. "The diagnostic computer's acting up," I told her. "Might take an extra hour." I watched her try to hide her panic, saw her fingers twitch toward her phone. She called James, making up some excuse about working late, while I pretended to check the engine. The desperation in her voice when she thought I couldn't hear. That was the first crack in her composure. I started leaving browser windows open on our shared computer, articles about local real estate developments, James's company projects. Nothing obvious, just enough to make her nervous. Sometimes I'd mention driving by one of his properties, completely casual. "They're building something new over on Maple Drive, aren't they?" Her coffee cup would shake slightly every time. The song became my secret weapon. I'd hum it sometimes while working in the garage, just loud enough for her to hear. Once at dinner, I asked her to put on some music and specifically requested something new and modern. The color drained from her face so fast, I thought she might faint. "I don't really know any new songs," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I got to know James's schedule, too, through his company's social media. Every Thursday, he had morning meetings downtown. So the next Thursday, I parked my truck where he could see it as he walked to his office. Just sat there, drinking coffee, reading the paper. He didn't know me, but that wasn't the point. The point was making him wonder if he should. During this time, I kept working on cars, kept my hands busy while my mind worked on the bigger problem. A Ferrari came into the shop. The owner complained about the entertainment system randomly playing music through the Bluetooth. "Happens sometimes," I told him. "Signals get crossed, systems get confused." I spent extra time studying that car's audio system, understanding how it could be manipulated. Linda started making mistakes. She'd forget which lies she'd told me, mix up her fake appointments. The pressure was getting to her. I could see it in the way she checked her phone more frequently, in how she'd startle at small noises. Once she called me James by accident when she was tired. She covered it quickly, turned it into a cough, but we both knew what I'd heard. I found myself staying up late in the garage, surrounded by the tools of my trade. Diagnostic computers, wiring diagrams, service manuals. They were comforting in their predictability. Cars make sense. They don't lie, they don't cheat. They just are what they are. When something's wrong, you can find the problem, fix it, move on. People are messier. Their betrayals can't be fixed with wrenches and wire cutters. But maybe I thought, looking at my tools, they could be fixed with other things. Modern cars are basically computers on wheels. They store data, they connect to phones, they remember patterns. And patterns, as any good mechanic knows, can be disrupted. The song that had become their secret signal could become something else entirely. It was just a matter of understanding the system, finding the right access points, and knowing exactly when to strike. Everything came together on a Wednesday night while I was working late at the shop. I'd been experimenting with a new Mercedes, testing how its Bluetooth system handled multiple device connections. That's when I figured out exactly how to do it. The plan crystallized in my mind, clean and simple, like when you finally diagnose a tricky engine problem. Modern car entertainment systems are complex things. They remember devices, they store preferences, they keep connection histories. But they can also be reset, reprogrammed, made to forget or remember whatever you want. I'd spent weeks learning the vulnerabilities, understanding how to make them do things their manufacturers never intended. I stayed up all night in the garage, practicing on different vehicles, making sure I could do it quickly, efficiently. The song played on repeat while I worked, but it didn't hurt anymore. It had become something else, a tool, like my wrenches and diagnostic computers. Their secret signal was about to become my weapon. Linda was getting more careless with her phone, probably from the stress of my psychological games. She'd leave it unlocked, forgotten on counters or tables. One morning, while she was in the shower, I finally got what I needed. Access to her Spotify account, her Bluetooth settings, everything. I memorized her passwords, studied her playlists. The song was everywhere, peppered throughout her listening history, like breadcrumbs leading to her guilt. James's car was my next target. He drove a high-end BMW, the kind with all the latest technology. I'd seen it parked outside his house during my surveillance, had watched Linda walk past it so many times. It took me 3 days of careful observation to get its Bluetooth identifier. Modern cars broadcast these constantly, invisible signals floating through the air, waiting for the right device to connect. I set everything up in my shop first, testing and retesting. Every step had to be perfect. I couldn't risk any mistakes, couldn't leave any room for error. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about precision, about using my expertise to expose their lies in a way that neither of them could deny or explain away. The final piece came together when I installed a new sound system in a customer's car. Looking at the wiring diagram, I realized I could do more than just connect to their devices. I could control them. Cars, phones, speakers. They're all just nodes in a network, and networks can be manipulated by someone who understands their architecture. That night, I sat in my garage, surrounded by diagnostic tools and technical manuals. The song played one last time as I finished my preparations. Tomorrow was Friday, their regular meeting day. They'd follow their usual pattern, play their usual music, think everything was normal. But this time, their soundtrack would play to a different ending. I checked my tools one final time, each one laid out in perfect order. In all my years as a mechanic, I'd never approached a job with such methodical precision. But then again, I'd never had to repair something as broken as my marriage, never had to expose a betrayal engineered over months or years. Tomorrow, their carefully maintained routine would become their undoing. Their song would play one last time, but not for the reasons they expected. Sometimes the best way to fix something is to make sure it breaks in exactly the right way. Friday morning, I got to the shop early. The playlist was ready on my phone, their song, remixed and sliced with fragments of their own conversations I'd recorded over weeks of surveillance. The Bluetooth interceptor I'd built was tested and perfect. All I needed now was patience. Linda left for work as usual, kissing me goodbye like nothing was wrong. I watched her car disappear down our street, knowing that in exactly 10 hours and 15 minutes she'd be parking outside James's house. Her routine was that precise, a fact that would work against her today. I kept myself busy with actual repairs, though my mind was on the clock. At 4:30, I closed the shop early. By 5 o'clock, I was parked in my usual surveillance spot near James's house, but this time with new equipment. The diagnostic tablet I used for car computers had been modified for a different purpose today. I watched its screen as it picked up nearby Bluetooth signals, waiting for the right ones to appear. At 6:15, right on schedule, Linda's car turned onto Maple Drive. I waited until she parked, watched her check her appearance in the mirror. When she reached for her phone to play their song, their little pre-meeting ritual, I activated my system. The first thing she'd notice would be the audio dropping out, a common enough glitch that it wouldn't raise suspicion. Then, as she reached to reconnect her phone, my system would intercept the signal. The beauty of modern car entertainment systems is their desperation to find familiar connections. Her car, recognizing what it thought was her phone, would automatically connect. I watched through my binoculars as she frowned at her phone, tapping the screen. Then it started, their song, but not quite. The first notes were normal, but then came the splice. Her own voice, recorded during one of their meetings, laughing at something he'd said. Her head snapped up. The music continued, but now interwoven with fragments of their conversations, their whispered plans, their secrets. Linda froze in her seat, her hand still on her phone. Through the windshield, I could see her face drain of color as more audio clips played through her car's speakers. Times, dates, locations, all their meetings, all their lies, wrapped in the melody they thought belonged to them. She tried to turn it off, but I'd locked the system. Modern cars are wonderful things. Once you're in their computers, you can control everything. The volume adjusted itself, not too loud, just perfectly, inescapably audible. Each snippet of conversation was crystal clear, a greatest hits album of their deception. James came out of his house right on time, wearing his usual confident smile. He could hear the music from Linda's car as he approached. I watched his stride falter as he recognized his own voice among the notes, promising Linda things he'd probably promised others before her. The look they exchanged through the car window was everything I'd hoped for. Pure, unfiltered panic. Their secret soundtrack had become public, their private melody transformed into a confession they couldn't take back. I watched through my binoculars as their carefully constructed world unraveled. James tried the passenger door, but Linda had locked it automatically when she'd parked, another habit I'd noted during my surveillance. She was fumbling with the entertainment system's controls, but nothing responded. Each button press just brought up another damning conversation, another secret moment they thought no one would ever hear. "Turn it off!" James was shouting through the window. His confident facade had cracked completely now. He kept looking around, probably wondering who else might be hearing this, who might be recording. The great property developer, so careful about his public image, now standing exposed on his own front lawn. Linda finally managed to turn the car back on, probably thinking she could override the system that way. Instead, the audio switched to their phone conversations. All those careful plans about meeting times, all those whispered endearments they thought were private. The car's speakers delivered each word with perfect clarity. I'd spent hours getting the audio quality just right. Their song kept playing underneath it all, a perfect background track to their destruction. Each time it looped back to the beginning, another layer of their deception played over it. Times when she'd called him while I was working late at the shop. Times he'd called her while she was supposedly at yoga. Every lie set to the music they'd made their own. More lights were coming on in neighboring houses now. A couple of people had come to their windows, drawn by the unusual activity. James noticed, too. I could see him becoming more desperate, pulling harder at the car door. But Linda just sat there, frozen, as their secrets played out for anyone who could hear. The best part was watching them realize just how much had been recorded. Their faces changed with each new revelation, all those careful plans, all those close calls they'd laughed about later, thinking they'd gotten away with it. The time they'd almost run into Linda's coworker at a restaurant 2 towns over. The time James had to hide his car because I'd come home early. Each memory now twisted into evidence. I'd installed a small camera in my truck to capture everything. The way James eventually backed away from the car, his practiced charm completely gone. The moment Linda finally got her door open but couldn't make herself step out, trapped between the exposing audio in her car and the growing number of curious neighbors. Their perfect little routine had become a public performance. What really got them was when their own jokes about me started playing. Linda laughing about how I never suspected, James calling me the oblivious mechanic. Those recordings were the hardest to get through when I was editing them, but now, watching their faces as they heard themselves, the pain was worth it. Sometimes the best revenge is just holding up a mirror. The finale was perfect, their song fading out as the last recording played. Linda's voice just that morning, telling me she loved me before leaving for work. The contrast between that casual lie and all the exposed truth hung in the air like exhaust fumes. In the silence that followed, I could see them both realizing that this was just the beginning. Anyone who'd heard, and people had definitely heard, would be talking about this for a long time. I didn't stay to watch them try to recover. The beauty of being a mechanic is knowing when a system is thoroughly broken. Instead, I drove back to our house, their next predictable destination. Linda would come here, probably with some desperate explanation ready. James would probably go into damage control mode, calling his PR team, trying to contain the spread of gossip that was already racing through the neighborhood. Back in our garage, I hooked up my laptop and checked the social media feeds I'd been monitoring. Sure enough, posts were already appearing. Someone had recorded parts of the audio on their phone. The great James Morrison standing helpless on his front lawn while his affair played out through car speakers. It was the kind of entertainment people couldn't resist sharing. I waited in my workshop, the place where I'd planned it all. Linda's car pulled up exactly 17 minutes later. She'd probably broken a few speed limits getting here. I could hear her heels on the driveway, quick and unsteady. When she burst through the door, she found me calmly cleaning my tools, her betrayal still playing softly through my phone's speakers. "How long?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. She didn't bother denying anything. The evidence was still echoing in her ears, probably would be for a long time. "Long enough," I replied, carefully putting away a wrench. "You know, cars record everything these days. GPS locations, Bluetooth connections, audio preferences. They're like little black boxes of people's lives. It's amazing what they remember." She sank onto the garage steps, her carefully maintained composure finally breaking. "The song? You used our song against us." "No," I corrected her, setting down my cleaning rag. "I used your song, the one you never played around me, the one that was just for you and him. I just helped it reach a bigger audience." Her phone was buzzing constantly now. Probably James, possibly others who'd witnessed their exposure. The neighborhood gossip network was highly efficient. By morning, everyone would know. Their secret song would become a public symphony. I'm a mechanic, I continued, my voice steady. When something's broken, I fix it. Sometimes that means exposing all the damaged parts first, making sure everyone can see exactly what went wrong. Tom, please, she started, but I cut her off. Your stuff is packed in the spare room. I did that while you were at yoga? The sarcasm in that last word hung between us. Take what you need tonight. The rest we can figure out through lawyers. She stood up slowly, aged years in the past hour. At the door, she turned back. You didn't have to do it like this. You could have just confronted us privately. I picked up another tool, started cleaning it. You didn't have to do it at all. But we all make our choices. You chose your song. I just chose how it ended. The next morning, I opened my shop as usual. People bring their cars to mechanics when things break. That's just how it works. But today was different. Today, people brought their cars and their stories. News had spread through our suburban grapevine faster than any computer virus I'd ever seen. Mrs. Henderson, dropping off her Volvo, couldn't wait to tell me how she'd been walking her dog when it all happened. That song was so clear, she said, trying to gauge my reaction. Every single word they said, right there for everyone to hear. She didn't know I'd specifically calibrated the audio for that kind of clarity. By noon, James Morrison's company had issued a press release, some carefully worded statement about taking time off to focus on personal matters. The local news websites were already running with the story, not because of the affair, those happen all the time, but because of how it came out. Local business leader exposed through car's sound system was apparently too good a headline to ignore. Linda hadn't come back for her things. Instead, her sister showed up with a rental truck and a face full of conflicted emotions. She'd helped Linda move in with me 30 years ago. Now she was helping her move out, all because of a song and some clever programming. You know her phone's been blowing up, her sister said as she loaded boxes. Everyone she knows was either there or knows someone who was there. That song, they're calling it the Cheater's Chorus on social media. I kept working on cars while all this happened. Timing belts don't care about scandal, and brake pads don't fix themselves. But every car that came in reminded me of how I'd done it. Each entertainment system a potential weapon, each Bluetooth connection a possible secret keeper. James tried to call once, probably to threaten legal action. I let it go to voicemail. What could he say? That I'd hacked his car? That I'd invaded their privacy? Everything I'd recorded had happened in public spaces. They'd just never thought anyone was paying attention. The most interesting visitors were other mechanics from around town. They came with cars that needed work, but really they wanted to know how I'd done it, how I'd turned a car's systems against their owners so perfectly. I just shrugged, kept working. A good mechanic never reveals their diagnostic secrets. By evening, the video clips had gone viral locally. You couldn't check Facebook or Twitter without seeing James standing there, helpless, while his BMW betrayed him. The comments were brutal. People love seeing successful men brought down, especially by their own technology. The song had become a meme, with people adding their own remixes of the incident online. A week after the incident, my shop had never been busier. People were bringing in their cars for security checks, all while trying to get me to talk about what happened. Every time their song played on someone's radio, and people were playing it constantly now, I could see them watching me, waiting for a reaction. But I just kept working, kept fixing what was broken. James Morrison's perfect life unraveled faster than a timing belt in a flooded engine. His business partners called an emergency board meeting. Turns out, wealthy clients don't like their real estate dealings handled by someone who's become a local scandal. Especially when that scandal involves their cars potentially spying on them. His company's stock took a hit, and the board suggested he take an extended leave of absence. Linda had moved in with her sister temporarily. Through the grapevine, I heard she'd quit her job at the medical billing office. Too many whispers in the break room, too many people suddenly remembering late nights when they'd seen her car somewhere it shouldn't have been. The song would play in the office sometimes, someone's idea of a joke, and she'd have to leave the room. The technical community got involved too. Some local tech blog did a whole write-up about car system vulnerabilities, using what I'd done as a case study. They got most of the details wrong, but the message was clear. Our connected cars know our secrets, and someone with the right knowledge can make them talk. Other stories started coming out. A guy at the country club recognized James's pattern. He'd apparently done this before, always with married women, always with the same careful planning. Each revelation added another verse to their song, another layer to their public humiliation. I kept all the recordings, stored safely in multiple places. Not to use them again, I'd made my point, but as insurance. James's lawyers had sent a carefully worded letter about potential legal consequences. I had my own lawyer send back an equally careful response about public space recordings and documented patterns of deception. They hadn't bothered me since. The most unexpected visitor was James's wife. I hadn't even known he was married. He'd kept that hidden from Linda, too. She came to the shop late one afternoon, elegant in an expensive suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage. I needed to meet the mechanic, she said, looking around my shop with curious eyes. The man who finally caught him. Do you know how many others there were? I shook my head, keeping my hands busy with an alternator. 7 that I know of, she continued. Always the same routine, always so careful, until you and your cars. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. He loved his high-tech vehicles, his perfect sound systems. Ironic that they brought him down. Before she left, she handed me a business card. My divorce lawyer, she explained. He's very good with digital evidence. Her smile was as cold as a frozen engine. That song you used? I'm going to play it in court. That night, alone in my garage, I finally let myself really listen to their song again. It was everywhere now, remixed, memed, turned into something they'd never intended. People had added their own layers to it, their own stories of betrayal and revenge. It had stopped being just their song, or even my weapon. It had become something else entirely. A warning, maybe. A reminder that in our connected world, our secrets are only as safe as the technology we trust to keep them. 3 weeks after the incident, I got an unexpected delivery at the shop. A brand new BMW, still with temporary plates, with a work order for a complete security inspection. The customer name was just J.M. The irony wasn't lost on me. James Morrison's old car had probably become too uncomfortable to drive, too many memories embedded in its digital brain. I spent extra time on that inspection, checking every system, every connection. The car was perfect, of course, factory fresh with all the latest technology. But as I went through the diagnostics, I found myself thinking about how many secrets these machines keep. How many stories are stored in their computers, waiting for someone who knows how to read them. Linda had finally emptied out her side of the house. She'd come when she knew I'd be at work, but she'd left something behind, a handwritten note and a USB drive. The note was short. I know you probably have copies of everything, but here's what he had of me. Do whatever you want with it. You already have. The USB drive contained pictures, messages, more recordings of their song. But I didn't need them anymore. The technology that had exposed their affair had taken on a life of its own. People were getting their cars checked, changing their passwords, becoming paranoid about their smart devices. Our connected world suddenly seemed less secure, more prone to betrayal, just like their marriage. James's wife filed for divorce using a legal team that specialized in digital evidence. Their song played during the preliminary hearing, not my version, but the original. The judge had allowed it as evidence of pattern and practice. I heard James finally cracked when they started playing his voice, all those recordings proving how long he'd been doing this to different women. The tech blogs hadn't let up either. Articles about the mechanic's revenge kept circulating, each one theorizing about how I'd done it. Some got close to the truth, others went wild with speculation. Car manufacturers were reportedly updating their security protocols. People were checking their vehicles for spyware, all because of a song and some clever programming. I kept working, kept fixing cars. But something had changed in how people saw me. Other mechanics started sending me their difficult diagnostic cases. People trusted me with their car problems because they knew I could solve them. Maybe not in the way they expected, but I got results. Late one night, as I was closing up the shop, a young guy brought in his car. "My wife," he said, not meeting my eyes. "She's been, I think—" He couldn't finish, but he didn't need to. I looked at his car, a late model with all the latest connectivity features. "Sometimes," I told him, "the hardest part of fixing something is admitting it's broken." I handed him back his keys. "But there are always signs if you know where to look." He nodded, understanding what I wasn't saying. As he drove away, I could hear music playing from his car, not their song, but something else, something personal. Every car tells a story if you know how to listen. I just taught everyone to listen a little more carefully. 6 months later, their song was still playing, but it had stopped hurting. It had become something else entirely, a case study in digital forensics, a warning about technology's hidden eyes and ears, a modern cautionary tale. Local DJs would play it sometimes, usually with some comment about keeping your secrets analog. James Morrison had left town, his reputation and business in tatters. His wife's divorce settlement had been substantial, backed by all that digital evidence. She'd sold their house, the one where he'd met Linda, and who knows how many others. The new owners had completely renovated it, as if trying to erase the memories stored in its walls. Linda had moved to another state, somewhere without smart traffic lights and Bluetooth-enabled cars. Her sister told me she was working at a small medical practice, starting over. The last thing she'd said to me in a final email was that she couldn't listen to music anymore without wondering who else might be listening too. My shop had changed. Word had gotten around about my particular skills with car computers. People brought me their vehicles for different reasons now, not just mechanical problems, but digital ones too. Questions about privacy, about security, about what their cars might be recording. I'd become something of an expert in automotive discretion. The tech world hadn't forgotten either. Car manufacturers had rolled out new security updates, promoting enhanced privacy features in their latest models. Tech blogs still referenced the mechanic's method when discussing digital privacy. I'd even been offered speaking gigs at cybersecurity conferences, which I always declined. I fixed cars. I didn't give speeches. But it wasn't just about the technology anymore. People would sit in my waiting room watching me work, and I could see the questions in their eyes. Not about how I'd done it, but why. Why expose them so publicly? Why use their own song, their own words against them? They wanted to know if the revenge had been worth it. The truth was, it had never been about revenge, not really. It was about exposure, bringing what was hidden into the light. In my 30 years as a mechanic, I'd learned that problems don't go away just because you ignore the warning lights. Sometimes you need to run a full diagnostic, expose every fault, before you can start fixing things. One afternoon, almost a year later, a familiar face showed up at my shop, one of James's former business partners. He needed his car checked, he said, but I could tell he had questions. As I worked on his engine, he finally asked what everyone wanted to know. "Did you ever regret doing it that way, making it so public?" I wiped my hands on a shop rag, considering the question. You know what happens when you ignore a small problem in an engine? It gets bigger, spreads to other systems. Pretty soon, everything's contaminated. I closed the hood of his car. Secrets are like that, too. The longer they run, the more damage they do. He nodded, understanding more than I'd said. His company had found other victims of James's pattern after everything came out. Other songs, other secrets, other betrayals that might have continued if I hadn't exposed this one. The shop was quiet that evening as I finished up paperwork. Someone down the street was playing their music loud enough to hear. Not their song, just something new on the radio. I thought about Linda, about James, about all the people whose lives had changed because of what I'd done, about all the cars in my lot, each one holding its own stories, its own secrets. I still had the USB drive Linda had left, still had all the recordings, but I didn't need them anymore. The technology that had exposed their affair had taught everyone a lesson, not just about infidelity, but about truth in our digital age. Every connection leaves a trace, every secret has its digital fingerprint, every betrayal writes its own code. In the end, their song had become everyone's song, a reminder that in our connected world, the truth always finds its way out. You just need to know how to listen for it, how to read the signs, how to interpret the data. That's what good mechanics do. We find the problems, expose them, fix them. Sometimes the fix hurts, sometimes it's messy. But in the end, everything runs better in the light.